In the early hours of May 27th, two women were murdered in the English town of Erdington. Both of them had spent the night out dancing and drinking with friends. Both of them had visited the Tyburn House on the evening of their deaths. Both of them had been killed in the same manner, and both of their bodies had been discovered in a ditch just 400 yards apart from each other. You would think, hearing these details, that the village of Erdington might have a serial killer on their hands. And indeed, in both of these cases, the primary suspect was a man with the surname Thornton. But these two women weren't murdered by the same man. In fact, they weren't even murdered in the same century. Today, we're here to talk about the mirrored murders of Mary Ashford and Barbara Forrest, who were killed on the same day under eerily similar circumstances in the same town, 157 years apart.
Every night is just like Halloween, and rock and roll this graveyard scene. Graveyard rock.
In 1817, 20-year-old Mary Ashford was a beautiful and well-liked young woman living in the town of Erdington, a suburb of Birmingham in the English West Midlands. Mary had been looking forward to attending a dance at the Tyburn House Inn, but in the days leading up to the party, it's said that Mary reported feeling a sense of dread to those close to her, and she told friends that she had a bad feeling about the week to come. So Mary spent the day of the dance working her job as a housekeeper at her uncle's estate before arriving at her friend Hannah Cox's house, where she had dropped off the dress that she was to wear to the party. Hannah and Mary got ready for the dance together and departed to Tyburn House. At the party, Hannah and Mary danced and enjoyed the festivities. And at some point during this hot girl night out, the pair hit it off with a couple of fellas by the name of Benjamin Carter and Abraham Thornton. Mary and Hannah spent the rest of the night hanging out with them. And around midnight, the two girls left the party in the company of their two suitors. The four of them walked along Chester Road, but ultimately they parted ways. Hannah headed home, her boy Benjamin went back to the party, but Mary and Abraham Thornton walked on together towards Mary's grandfather's house. It's not exactly clear what happened after the group split up, but it's believed that Mary never arrived at her grandfather's house. Instead, she showed up at Hannah's house a couple hours later at 4 a.m. According to Hannah, Mary seemed to be in a good mood when she arrived and didn't appear frightened or distressed at all. At Hannah's, Mary changed out of the dress that she'd worn to the party and back into her work clothes that she wore as a housekeeper to her uncle's estate. Hannah asked Mary what she'd been up to all night, and Mary said that her and Abraham had been out walking all night, walking and just talking to each other, and that they'd finally said their goodbyes for the night. So after she changed, Mary headed out, telling Hannah that she had to get to work at her uncle's estate before he left for the market for the day. Witnesses who were actually leaving the party at Tyburn House saw Mary. They came forward and said that they saw Mary hurrying along the road by herself around 4:30 a.m., but she never made it to her uncle's house. A few hours later, a factory worker walking to work found blood along the road, and he followed a trail of footprints and scattered items of women's clothing to a gravel ditch where Mary Ashford's body was recovered partially submerged in water. It was determined that Mary had been sexually assaulted before her death, and that after her killer threw her into the flooded ditch, she drowned. Footprints surrounding the scene showed that a man and a woman had walked to the area together, but that only the man had left. It didn't take long for the body to be identified as Mary Ashford. A group of local men surrounded the scene, and one of them rode to Tyburn House to ask about Mary's attendance at the dance. The owner of Tyburn House said that Mary had spent most of her evening in the company of Abraham Thornton. So the owner of Tyburn House himself rode out looking for Abraham. Now, let's talk about old Abe. He was around 24, so not much older than Mary. He was a farmer and a builder, and he was described as being a heavy-set but well-looking fellow. So I'm thinking my man has like thick boy teddy bear energy, okay? He's giving a little bit of like Samuel Tarly. Am I wrong? But don't be fooled by them puppy eyes, baby, because he might be a killer. Anyway, so the owner of Tyburn House rode out looking for Abraham Thornton. And when he found him, he told Abraham Thornton that Mary Ashford had been found dead. And Thornton seemed shocked. And he was like, I was with her until 4 a.m. And then Thornton rode back to Erdington with the owner of Tyburn House. And once there, Thornton was immediately questioned and arrested for Mary's murder. Initially, Thornton admitted to having had relations you know what I mean, with Mary the night before. He said that the two of them had spent the night lying in a field, talking, looking at the stars, and, you know, one thing had led to another. So then they start searching Thornton, and they found blood on his underclothes. And he's saying, I told you, me and Mary were together. That's not murder blood. That's like sex blood. Totally different thing. And the thing is, normally I would call bullshit on this, okay? But it was determined that Mary had been on her period when she died. So if she had had consensual sex with Thornton, there could be some blood on his skivvies afterwards. You know what I mean? So can't totally call bullshit on this claim. So Thornton went on to say that after him and Mary hooked up, he walked her back to Hannah's house so that she could change back into her work clothes. And he waited outside for a while, but she never came back out. Now, this part I am skeptical of because, first of all, Hannah says that when Mary went up, she said that her and Thornton had said goodnight. So Mary gave the impression that she didn't expect to see him outside when she left. Second of all, Hannah said that Mary was in a rush to change and get to work, right? So why is he saying that it took her so long to come out that he eventually gave up and walked away? You know, just assumed she wasn't coming back out and left, all right? How long was he waiting, really? I don't know. This part's a little sketchy, but whatever. Thornton says that the last time that he saw Mary was when he walked her to Hannah's house. Then he ended up leaving, not waiting outside Hannah's house any longer, and he walked on home. So by the time that this case went to trial, public opinion was heavily against Thornton. People were out in the street selling all these pamphlets, okay, that dramatized the murder with illustrations and poems and everything. And they painted this whole scene where Mary was this poor, innocent doe, and Thornton was this savage brute who had ravaged her, okay? And the trial went much the same way, with the prosecution alleging that after Mary refused Thornton's advances, he went out and waited in the field for her, and then he sprung out while she was walking to work and attacked her and killed her. And the prosecution's theory is that Mary fainted during the assault, okay? And that's why she drowned when she was thrown into the ditch. And the reason they had to go with this, oh, so very old-timey, women are hysterical and she fainted trope is because it was determined that there were no other signs of violence on Mary Ashford's body. Her cause of death had been drowning, but there were no other wounds. And the tearing that they found, you know, down there, could have been caused also by consensual relations, okay? So they couldn't quite determine that she had been so ravaged as the pamphlets being handed out outside would have you believe, okay? And the problem, ultimately, with the prosecution's theory is that they had no real evidence to prove Thornton's guilt. The blood on Thornton's underclothes and the lacerations on Mary's parts had a plausible explanation if they had had consensual relations. The only other thing that they had was that these men had come and they had matched Thornton's footprints to the footprints found in the field. But under cross-examination, these men admitted that they didn't go out and try to compare Thornton's shoes to the footprints found in the field after he'd already been arrested and in jail for a while, and there had been several heavy rainfalls out in the field. So those footprints were already really distorted. So the match, ultimately, is inconclusive. There's not any evidence. Plus, Thornton had a solid alibi. A milkman testified that he saw Thornton at 4:30 a.m. and Thornton was walking leisurely past a farm that was 3.6 to 4 kilometers away from the place where Mary was murdered. And you know that milkman knew exactly what time it was when he saw Thornton because he walks his route every single day, right? So he knows what time he usually gets to each house. So he knew where he was, he knew what time it was. So it's a very reliable witness, okay? So we can pretty confidently say that Thornton was at this farm 3.6 to 4 kilometers away from where Mary was murdered at 4:30 a.m. And remember, there were witnesses that saw Mary at 4:30 a.m. walking down the road where she was murdered. And then around 4:50 a.m., Thornton was seen in his own hometown, which was the next town over from Erdington. It was Castle Bromfield. Am I right? Anyway, Thornton was seen in his hometown by a gamekeeper who knew who he knew. They were buddies, okay? And Thornton stopped to talk to this gamekeeper, and he told him, he kind of bragged a little bit. He was like, oh, I spent the night with a woman and I really like her. And the two talked for about 15 minutes before Thornton walked on home to his father's house. And like I said, since the witness who had seen Mary walking along the road around 4:30 a.m. was pretty sure about the time that they'd seen her, the window was too short. Even if that witness was off by 10 or so minutes, right? It still wouldn't be enough time for him to get all the way home. So at the end of all of this, the judge presiding over the trial addressed the jury, and he told them that they had to set aside any prejudice that they had in their minds about hearing that Mary may have had relations with Thornton, because obviously at this time, that was a shocker for these people. It's 1817, baby. The idea that this 20-year-old woman was out, up to hoe shit out in a field. You know what I mean? Anyway. So judge says, put any prejudice you have about the idea that Mary might have had relations with this man, put it out of your mind, okay? Because we're not here to judge that. He reminded them that they were only to consider the evidence that had been presented at the trial when trying to decide if Thornton was guilty or not guilty. And he said to them that it was better that a murderer go free than an innocent man be convicted. And after the judge's pep talk, the jury took 6 minutes to deliberate before returning a verdict of not guilty. Now, this makes sense, given the evidence that was presented. It's not enough to convict him, right? But the problem is that the public had already decided Thornton's guilt. So when the verdict was announced, the public outcry was fierce. And leading the charge was Mary's brother, William Ashford. And he brought an appeal of murder against Thornton, which was this kind of archaic law. In English law at this time, it was basically a private party seeking to prosecute someone for a crime without the need for the crown's involvement at all. So William Ashford brings this appeal of murder against Thornton, and Thornton is arrested again. The problem is, in this case, it's not England versus Thornton, it's Ashford versus Thornton. And not only is this appeals law kind of archaic, but the ways to handle it also were pretty archaic, because an appeal allowed for trial by combat. So once this court case commences, the judge asks Thornton how he pleads, and he says that he pleads not guilty and declares that he's willing to defend his innocence with his body. Then, in this super theatrical moment, okay, he puts on a pair of leather gauntlets, and then he throws another pair down in front of Ashford, thereby challenging him to trial by combat. And at this point, Ashford and his counsel totally panicked. They forgot about this whole trial by combat part of it, and they were not prepared to tussle with Thornton, okay? Mary's brother William was just 22 years old, and he was described as being petite and ill-suited to battle, okay? Well, remember, Thornton, he's a big, beefy boy. So Ashford and his counsel scramble to try to figure out what they can do. And then they go to the judge, and they're like, this isn't fair. And their argument was that Thornton had already murdered Mary, so he shouldn't get a chance to murder her brother, too. But the judge overseeing the trial was just as serious as the judge who had overseen the first trial. And he was like, oh, no. This is English law, okay? It's not murder. You can't call it murder. So Ashford and his counsel instead tried to convince Thornton's barrister to not let him do this. They were like, you can't let him do this. You have to reel your client in. And Thornton's lawyer is like, actually, I'm the one who told him to do this, because considering the public opinion that you stirred up out here, there's no chance that a impartial jury can be found in this area. So trial by jury is out for my client. So he's got to do this, all right? He's got to fight you. So for the next 6 months, Ashford tried to worm his way out of meeting Thornton in battle. First, he fired his counsel and got a new legal team. And they tried repeatedly to argue for reasons why trial by combat shouldn't be allowed, but the judge continued to deny their motions until finally Ashford agreed to just drop the whole thing, and Thornton was once again acquitted for murder. This time, after Thornton was freed from the courthouse, he had to escape out a side door, and he narrowly escaped an angry mob waiting outside the courthouse for him. After the Ashford v. Thornton case, a bill banning private appeals was introduced, and Thornton was the last defendant in English law to be granted trial by combat. So following his second acquittal, Thornton tried to return to his home, but the public hostility against him was too much to bear. So he tried to escape England by booking passage to New York aboard the Independence. But when his fellow passengers found out who he was kicked off the boat at Liverpool. Luckily, Liverpool, being far enough away from the Birmingham area, he was able to lie low for a little bit until he finally got another ship and made it to New York. In New York, he found work as a bricklayer, he got married, he had a family, okay? So Thornton had a happy ending. Whether he deserved it or not, I don't know. As far as I can tell, he was never accused of another crime, like the murder of Mary Ashford. And the truth, I really don't know. I don't know if he's guilty or not, but I know that there wasn't enough evidence to convict him of that murder. And since the witness who claimed to have seen Mary Ashford walking on the road at 4:30 was coming from the party at Tyburn House, that means that there were other people at that time probably filtering out of that party, right? So there are other suspects in the pool there, right? Because, like, what if somebody felt jilted by her at the party? What if somebody was jealous of how she was carrying on with Thornton? You know, there was another guy who was walking to work, right? So it's very possible that there were other people out and about, someone who might have seen Mary out there by herself and made a crime of opportunity, right? And to me, one of the most tragic details about this whole case is the incredibly offensive grave marker that Mary Ashford got stuck with. It reads, "As a warning to female virtue and a humble monument to female chastity, this stone marks the grave of Mary Ashford, who, in the 20th year of her age, having incautiously repaired to a place of amusement without proper protection, was brutally violated and murdered on May 27th, 1817. Like, imagine being buried under a rock that's trying to victim blame you, dude. That's so annoying. And anyway, that warning did nothing to prevent another girl from being murdered in the exact same way as Mary Ashford 157 years later. It was May 27th, 1974. Once again, a Whit Monday, which is actually a particularly odd coincidence. I wasn't familiar with Whit Monday before researching this case, but Whit Monday is a Pentecostal day, and it moves around every year because it's based on it's the day after the Pentecost, which is based on Easter, okay? And it's important to note that it moves around all the time, and that the determination of which day Easter Sunday falls on is this whole complex algorithm that follows the ecclesiastical lunar calendar. So it doesn't even... It's hard to understand. And I tried to determine the statistical likelihood of a Whit Monday falling on May 27th, but it's really hard to figure that out. The best that I could come up with was that it's about a 2% chance that Whit Monday will fall on May 27th. So let's just say it's a pretty weird coincidence, okay? That it's Whit Monday again, and it's May 27th again. And a 20-year-old young woman named Barbara Forrest is out dancing and drinking with her friends. Barbara was described as being very intelligent and kind. She was active in her church and devoted to her job as a nurse at a children's home. On the evening of Whit Monday, she was in the company of her boyfriend, and they were going to various pubs to celebrate the holiday. It's said that the pair even stopped at Tyburn House, the very same place that Mary Ashford spent the night dancing with Abraham Thornton before she was murdered. But around 1 a.m., Barbara's boyfriend walked her down to the bus stop so that she could catch a bus home. He didn't wait for her there at the bus stop, so he did just leave her there. And it's unknown whether Barbara ever got on the bus. No one who came forward who rode the bus that night could recall seeing Barbara on it. Days later, Barbara's body was found in a ditch along Chester Road, not far from where the body of Mary Ashford had been found over 150 years before. There were signs that she'd been assaulted, and her cause of death was determined to be strangulation. After a massive investigation, a suspect was arrested, a man named Michael Thornton. This Thornton worked with Barbara at the children's home, and like the previous Thornton, bloodstains were found on his clothing. This, in addition to a false alibi that was provided by his mother, were the only evidence that were presented against Thornton in the trial. There's not a lot of information about what happened during this trial, but it was a very short trial, and he was ultimately acquitted because there was just not enough evidence. I don't know if there was any particular reason why they looked at him, if they were just looking at all of the people whom Barbara knew, or if there was some kind of history between Barbara and this guy. But ultimately, the only evidence that they had against him was some blood on his clothes and the fact that his mama tried to give him an alibi, and it was proven that she was lying, okay? So that's all they had. And in yet another chilling coincidence, it was noted that before her death, Barbara reported feeling a sense of dread to those close to her, just like Mary Ashford had. Allegedly, Barbara said to a friend, "This is going to be an unlucky month. I just know it. Don't ask me why." So let's rack up the similarities between these two cases again. Both women were 20 years old. Both had gone out dancing and had visited the Tyburn House on the night of their death. Both of them were killed on Whit Monday, May 27th. Both were dumped along the same road in a ditch just 400 yards apart from each other. And the suspect in both cases was named Thornton, who only had the evidence of blood on their clothing to tie them to the murder and was ultimately acquitted due to lack of evidence. And both cases now remain unsolved. Now, of course, all of this is probably just a bizarre coincidence. But for a moment, let's entertain the idea that it's not. What then? Was Barbara Forrest a reincarnation of Mary Ashford, set to relive the same short life and tragic end? Or was there some kind of twisted individual who was aware of what had happened on Whit Monday, May 27th in Erdington, 157 years before, who chose to lie in wait along Chester Road in order to create a copycat killing of the murder that had happened there of Mary Ashford? If that's the case, there's still a lot of unaccounted for synchronicities, like the girls' ages being the same, their activities through the night lining up so closely, and the accused suspects in the murders sharing a surname. So what do you think? Is it just a coincidence? Let me know. All right. And I also gotta apologize for the fact that I haven't put out a video in a while, okay? You already know, baby. I was on deadline, okay? I really got down to the grindstone, basically wrote a whole new book in like less than a month because the first version was just not cutting it, okay? It just wound up that way, all right? I started revising and I was like, you know what? We got to change everything. So ended up needing to write a whole new book. Couldn't make any videos. Spent all my time just being a little ghoul, goblin ghoul behind my computer screen, all right? And I wish that I could say that I'm back, don't worry. But I got a call next week with more notes, okay? So I got to revise again. Got to do a little bit more revising. Oh, this is just a process, all right? This is how it goes, okay? And my editor, they are a genius. So I'm very excited to get this book where it needs to be. This is my book 2, by the way. If you haven't pre-ordered my first book, Here Lies a Vengeful Bitch, what are you waiting for, okay? You got to pre-order it now because you know what? I'm going to be done with this book 2 soon. I only gotta start talking about book 3. And I really want my publisher to be convinced that we need another Here Lies a Vengeful Bitch, a sequel, okay? Season 2 of Here Lies a Vengeful Bitch. So you gotta help me. You help me make that happen by pre-ordering Here Lies a Vengeful Bitch. If you're new here and you don't know about my book, Here Lies a Vengeful Bitch, it's about a girl named Annie Lane who was murdered. That's not gonna slow her down. She comes back from her grave to hunt down anyone responsible for her murder, okay? It's a feminist revenge thriller with a little cozy ghost story tucked in because she also, she's got a crush on this beatnik biker bad boy Phantom who's showing her the ropes of how to be dead, all right? Helping her out, solving this mystery. Very romantic. They go to a corn maze and they dance in a graveyard together, okay? What more do you want? Halloween vibes. It all takes place during Halloween, okay? So if you're into that, pre-order Here Lies a Vengeful Bitch. If you already pre-ordered, thank you, I love you, because we're trying to get season 2. Season 2 greenlit, okay? Thank you for hanging out with me here. Hope we can hang out again soon. I love you. Good night.